Get connected. You're listening to Get Connected. Thanks for joining us. In this series, we discuss the various issues shaping your industry, how the changes in supplier ecosystems impact the way you work on a daily basis, how your customers consume the services you create, and how the industry as a whole steps up to the demands of the digital marketplace. Let's get connected.
Hello, listener. Let's get connected. My name is Chris Lewis. By day, I'm an independent industry analyst. By night, as I'm sure you know by now, I'm a podcaster. Welcome to Get Connected, where we delve into the issues shaping the networking industry and the experiences we all benefit from by being better connected. In this episode, we're talking about the underlying network infrastructure and how we manage it for the modernization of the telco, the new generation of CSPs, and how they build their services to address all of those evolving customer requirements. Now, I'm always excited when we build the framework for these podcasts, but I'm especially excited today because we're going right back to the basics of creating the technology that actually addresses the issue of building this underlying network infrastructure and delivering it for the future of the industry. Today, I'm joined by two people. One who's created the underlying technology, and the other whose challenge is to implement the technology for the modern CSP. Welcome, Mansoor, and welcome, Ben.
Hi, great to be here.
Glad to be here.
So, Mansoor, let's kick off with you. Could you please introduce yourself and your role to our listener?
Yes, hi. I'm Mansoor Karam. I was previously founder and CEO of Appstra, and I'm currently VP Products at Juniper, responsible for the Appstra business.
Thank you, Mansoor. Pleasure to have you with us. And Ben, tell me about yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm Ben Baker. I've been with Juniper for about 10 years now, and before that, many years in and around the networking and communication service provider space. Right now, I'm responsible for marketing our cloud and data center portfolio, as well as business case analysis for customers across the entire Juniper portfolio.
I'm sure we'll come back to that business analysis later on in the episode. But Mansoor, to begin with, perhaps just setting context for us, what is Appstra? Is it a toolkit? Is it a management platform? What is this Appstra thing that you created?
Yeah, Appstra is a management solution for networks. What it does is that it automates all aspects of designing, building, and operating your data center network, essentially the entire life cycle. We've invented this concept called intent-based networking. The idea is that instead of an operator dealing with how, the specifics of the commands, etc., they're dealing with the what, right? The outcomes they're trying to achieve in terms of connectivity, security, quality of experience, etc. So it's a really powerful approach to automation. And what it does, it delivers this unparalleled operational simplicity, which means that now customers can go quickly, but they don't have to get involved into the details. So they can really go at the speed of the business. While, since the software is taking care of all of the details, it provides unrivaled levels of reliability. Reliability is really key in networking. You want to achieve the highest levels of reliability given how foundational the network is. And also because now you're dealing at the outcome level, and you're not dealing with the specifics of the how, we have these layers of abstractions, which makes the solution completely multi-vendor, meaning that it works with equipment from multiple vendors, not just Juniper. And this is actually key to many organizations out there, and especially service providers.
Because you created, the motivation behind this was very much in the data center. So it was an enterprise-oriented development. So was that your pure motivation, or did you saw this evolution of the requirement of the underlying network? How did you see that, or what motivated you to do it in the first place?
What motivated us, and that was back in 2014 when we started Appstra, was that there was a lot of innovation happening on the device side. It used to be that equipment was we only were able to configure it using the command line interface. But then vendors were introducing APIs, powerful APIs that you could use to both configure these devices, but also collect telemetry from these devices. And these innovations came because they were requirements from the cloud, the hyperscalers at the time. They were emerging and they were building these data centers at scale. Then they needed, a programmatic approach to manage their infrastructures. And so, they were leading, but then for every enterprise out there, the network was becoming increasingly foundational, increasingly critical to everything they were trying to achieve. Gartner has famously said that you're 3 times more likely to fail at your digital transformation initiative if you don't transform your network first. And so enterprises needed to transform their networks. And you had the APIs, but what you lacked was the tools. You really didn't have management solutions at the time that were helping them get there. And so, a lot of times they were just managing their networks device by device by kind of typing in the commands to configure those devices. And if something happened in their networks, that really didn't have the right visibility in order to figure out what's going on. So that was the motivation. Networks were becoming critical, not just for the hyperscalers, not just for service providers, but for every enterprise out there. And there was a big gap in terms of the tools that will allow those operators to manage those networks in an automated way to help them transform the network for them to be successful in their digital transformations.
It's so encouraging because as an analyst who at one time specialized in network management, it delights me to hear how we're bringing all these things together to be able to manage it in a unified way rather than having to understand how every separate management system worked, which was always been a nightmare given the way that the network evolves within this service provider environment. Now, Ben, with your service provider hat on or through a service provider lens, how do you see this?
Well, it's an interesting question of how the Appstra philosophy fits in with the Juniper telco philosophy. And we actually tried building a DC fabric management solution ourselves a few years ago, but we found it incredibly difficult to do. And we eventually realized that, hey, there's a product out there that's exactly like what we wanted to build, and it was mature, it had a growing customer base, so we bought it. And as Mansoor touched on a couple of these things, Appstra fits well with how Juniper has always approached the telco marketplace. For example, in terms of being open, Appstra is multi-vendor, and nearly all of the environments that Juniper operates in today are multi-vendor. And also, if you think about reliability, historically, this could just be the one single word that you would use to describe what drives a telco business. And as it turns out, reliability is a key founding principle of Appstra. And the idea that the blueprints that Appstra is based upon essentially give you that reliability and consistency. And this is what ultimately gives you speed of operations. And as Mansoor pointed out, this is one of the key insights that we can all learn from the cloud hyperscalers who are masters at managing their infrastructure. So Juniper has this fantastic solution for the overlay, and that's our Contrail product that everyone knows about that orchestrates cloud workloads and virtual networks. And now with Appstra, we have this fantastic solution to manage the data center underlay.
Very interesting, and I'm sure we'll come back to that overlay topic. Conversely, that leads me to ask you, Mansoor, why Juniper for Appstra?
The first thing I'd say is what Ben mentioned, right? This open culture, right? From the beginning, Juniper was a challenger in the networking space, and they led by having open as a key foundation, right? And so they're, very involved in standards, ensuring their solutions work in multi-vendor environments. And so for us at Appstra, we deeply cared that the technology that we brought in was going to continue in the same fashion. And not only was it important to Appstra, it was also important to our customers. They really cared about the multi-vendor aspect, the open aspect of the solution. And indeed, Juniper was committed to that. They committed for Appstra, as in the management solution, not only to work with Juniper switches, but also Cisco and Arista and even Sonic, which is, in open source network operating system. And we support all of these today. So that was an important aspect. The other, of course, is Juniper's scale, right? In terms of the number of sellers out there, their service organizations. These are world-class organizations that really could reach customers, in every country. Right now, we're engaged in 63 countries, and we couldn't have done it without the help of the larger Juniper organization. The other thing I'd say is Juniper, in addition to it having this open approach, they're all about differentiated technologies, best of breed technologies. Of course, their switches, their security solutions, but then, what they've brought in with the acquisitions, like Mist, there is a lot there in terms of technologies that we felt if we were to integrate and kind of leverage, then we can deliver a really unique solution to our customers, a unified solution. Think of it as a single stack solution that is not only valid for the data center, but also to service providers and campus. And ultimately, we talk about data centers, but really what you're seeing customers do is integrate these different areas, that were siloed in the past. And so having, access to all of these technologies really felt like we could address our customer problems uniquely. And last but not least, I'd say, just from a pragmatic standpoint, customers buy software, especially management software, when they're buying their hardware. And I think for us, when we were an independent company, that was kind of part of our challenge, is to find those deals. Like, when is the customer actually buying hardware? Now being part of Juniper, of course, we have access to all of those deals. Juniper is very aware of when customers are making these hardware purchases, and essentially we can have that software conversations along with that.
That's so true. And what I observe as an analyst is that increasingly, we all have to say, of course, that every CSP, every telco is different. Every country market is different. So many parameters shaping it. But the breaking down of these silos is allowing the CSPs to actually build solutions, build infrastructure, build platforms, build services, which actually address those future requirements, which is a change from the old model where we used to build the technology and eventually expose the service to the customer. So it's a new generation.
That's correct.
So that gives us the background, why Juniper for Appstra. But more importantly, Ben, why Appstra for telco?
Well, when you're talking data center for the telco world, the SP world, at a high level, there's basically three use cases. Number one, enterprise IT applications. So every SP is, in some sense, just like any other enterprise, and they need to run their internal applications somewhere, whether that's ERP systems or CRM, HR, OSS, BSS, of course. And no doubt there is a move to public cloud and SaaS with these workloads, but there is still and will continue to be plenty of SP-owned and operated IT data center infrastructure. The second use case for telcos is to deliver managed services from their data centers. An important customer that Juniper Appstra has for this use case is T-Systems, which of course is part of Deutsche Telekom. The third use case is telco cloud, and a subset of that you can think of is edge cloud. An important customer we have here for Juniper Contrail and Appstra is Telefonica. And this use case of telco and edge cloud is really interesting, and there's so much activity in these areas. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that one of the most important strategic decisions facing most SPs around the world today is whether you should work with the hyperscalers, the public cloud providers, or should you do it yourself? And we think the answer is yes, you should do both. So we think it would be a huge mistake for an SP to just cede that telco cloud to hyperscalers. There has to be a DIY motion. SPs should develop in-house cloud-native platforms and technologies and expertise to protect their long-term interests and to maintain some control and leverage for their business. But at the same time, SPs should also develop balanced symbiotic relationships with the public cloud providers. And the Juniper portfolio can help an SP here. It changes the economics and gives you a positive business case for building and operating out your own cloud infrastructure.
I think that sort of economics and technology combined really fascinates me, because ultimately it is a supply and demand issue. It's a supply chain issue. And like you say, it's not whether you work with the hyperscalers, it's how you work with the hyperscalers. And Mansoor, from your point of view, you touched upon this bringing together almost a single stack of the sort of the Contrail and Appstra. From a telco point of view, do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, as Ben mentioned, Contrail handles the overlay, whereas Appstra handles the underlay. Both are, of course, really important. And as Ben mentioned, we have customers such as Telefonica, who is deploying both. Think of the underlay as like the equipment itself, all the devices, including the topology, all of the protocols that, essentially you're deploying in your infrastructure to make it all work. When we're talking about the networking equipment itself, Appstra manages these, whereas the overlay is really about the services that, including some network services that are being deployed on the server, right? And you can imagine that these two things have to be integrated. And indeed, we do integrate Appstra with Contrail. So for example, if you have some security service that needs to be deployed on a networking device, maybe because you have servers or storage that's connected to these devices, to which you're applying a security policy, then Appstra would take care of that. Whereas if you need to deploy a security policy on a server, then Contrail would do that. And these are generally two teams. And so you want to provide the visibility of one domain into the other domain. And so, bring in the server policy, the visibility to these server policies into Appstra so that the networking teams have visibility into that and vice versa.
You're right. That automation, that changing the economics, changing the way in which the CSPs think about these pieces, because in the past, some of that was separate silos, separate teams, like you say, but it's giving that visibility and the ability to manage it, through that one perspective.
Correct. And in fact, with our newest release here, we're introducing some specific capabilities which are targeted at telcos, specifically around multi-tenancy, for example, and edge computing. So with telco specifically, what we're seeing, or especially with telco, what we're seeing is that these networks are getting more and more distributed and closer to the edge. And so having the ability from one management platform to operate and automate not only centralized data centers, but distributed data centers across many geographical areas from one management platform becomes critical. And this is essentially what we have introduced in our latest release.
Great. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. So ironically, we're taking some of the lessons from the hyperscalers and what they did at scale in the cloud, and we're bringing that right down to wherever the edge manifests itself.
Correct.
But Ben, what are you hearing specifically from your SP customers? You mentioned a couple in your previous answer. What are they asking for and what are they looking to achieve?
So SPs are building out 5G, telco clouds, edge clouds, new managed services, and telco data center environments in general are bigger and messier than a typical enterprise. They've usually been in business for many decades. They just have more tools, more acquisitions, more legacy. And SPs understand that automation is absolutely critical. If you think about the economics of the telco business on the cost side, it's about CapEx and OpEx. And OpEx is at least 4 times as much in terms of size as the CapEx is. And so, automation is necessary for tackling that OpEx piece. And, most OpEx discussions start necessarily with dry process discussions. It's not glamorous, but it's, absolutely critical to go through process and how you're going to automate those different processes. And without automation to simplify operations, all these new initiatives that we're talking about, they just become more stuff to manage. Without a heavy dose of automation, you're just building out a bigger operational mess for yourself. But it's interesting that network operators often start with a different paradigm for DC network automation than maybe an enterprise or a hyperscaler does. An SP has, no surprise here, a telco network-centric view of the world. They first think about network or service orchestration and NMSs, network management systems, and WAN automation before they think about data center fabric management, for example. And of course, all the above are important. So these new SP cloud initiatives are multi-year projects where we work closely alongside our customers.
It is that changing nature of what the service provider, the CSP is. And it just occurs to me that what you just talked about then, there is a natural progression from that, which says, actually, what are we actually delivering to the end customer? So all the way through all of these layers, I think, Mansour, you mentioned this earlier on about using APIs and the visibility all the way through. At the end of the day, what is it we deliver to our customers? What do customers pay for? They pay for that fixed and mobile broadband, for those business services, and for being part of other value chains. So yeah, we need the basics, the business process stuff to work cleanly, and we need to be able to bring all of these parts together to make sure that connectivity piece becomes the essential underpinning of the way the offerings get built. And Mansoor, this has been your baby. You've developed it. It's grown. Two things. How do you see Appstra evolving, and what commonalities do you see between service provider, enterprise, and hyperscaler networks?
When I think of the Appstra evolution, the first thing I'll say is that we'll continue always, evolving, improving the technology. For example, by adding more flexibility so that we have the ability to address more use cases. Like, for example, as I mentioned with our newest release, we now have support for edge. Right? This is because we're now supporting these collapsed spine kind of topologies, which is an increment compared to what we had before, which now allows us to support these distributed edge data centers. And so we will continue doing that, evolving the technology, also adding more telemetry, always improving the intelligence of the solution. That will continue happening. But in addition to that, what excites me is that we're seeing a convergence, right? First, between the different, what used to be different segments, like, campus and data center and WAN. When you think now of a campus solution, it includes Wi-Fi, it includes the switches themselves, so the wired network, but it also includes SD-WAN. And usually these campuses are connected to data centers. Often you have, data centers within the campuses themselves. And, these data centers are typically connected to the cloud. And so you no longer have these silos, rather you have kind of a continuum. And, what we need is deliver to our customers tools that help them manage this network in the context of this continuum. And certainly Juniper has lots of exciting products there and technologies like Mist and Marvis with AI and machine learning. And you can imagine that integrations there will really deliver a lot of value to our customers in the context of this more continuous spectrum. And so that's, how I see Appstra evolving. And, to me, I see it as a really exciting development. I see a lot of exciting things for the future. And, when it comes to the commonality between enterprise and service provider, what I'll say is that there is convergence there as well. For example, it used to be that only service providers cared about these 5 nines of reliability. But you can imagine that enterprises today, they care as much about reliability. We've talked about how networks are at the core of everything they do. And we've all heard stories of, networks failing, causing disastrous damage to the business. And so reliability is becoming real critical to enterprises as well. So we're seeing convergence of requirements there. Another example is multi-vendor. A multi-vendor was always critical to service providers. And it used to be that enterprises were happy to buy, all their equipment from one vendor. But increasingly, again, because of how critical these networks have become, it's become necessary for these enterprises to have dual-sourced strategies. You can imagine that today, with supply chain issues, that is even more top of mind, or it makes it at least that much more clearer to these enterprises. If you're locked into your only one vendor, then if that vendor doesn't have equipment for you by the time you need it, then you're dead in the water. You should have a much, much better chance if you had more than one vendor in your environment. And so this is another example, multi-vendor, which now is kind of a requirement across both enterprises and service providers.
It's fascinating, isn't it, that we now look at that notion of reliability, and suddenly we don't know necessarily where the resource sits to deliver that, where the workflow goes, how the process goes. So actually managing all of that, having the visibility through something like Appstra is absolutely critical so that we can manage it. So if anything does happen to go wrong, that we've got the visibility, the reach through to be able to redress the problem.
Yeah, there was an ad, I think it was a tire ad from the 1980s. Power is nothing without control, right? So I'd say here, speed is nothing without reliability, right? If you move fast and you break things in networking, that's worse, But what is really important for enterprises to deliver on their requirements for their customers is to move fast, because they need to move at the speed of the business. But critically, they have to do it reliably with 100% reliability.
Mansoor, you're absolutely right. The changing nature of what the service provider has to do, managing, delivering all of those services wherever they might be required. And it's that change in, almost in structure, that inside-out model becoming an outside-in, where the demands on the network are so many and varied. So we have to have that visibility. We have to be able to manage all of those moving parts in order to be that critical component contributing to the digital marketplace. So my thanks to you, Mansoor, and Ben, for fantastic contributions. Mansoor, from your origins of Appstra, building it up and growing that business. Ben, with your perspective from the service providers and what's coming out of the marketplace today. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there you have it, listener. We've talked about Appstra, building the tools, the infrastructure, the platform that is essential as the blurring of lines takes place between the data center, the hyperscaler, the enterprise, and the service provider. We acknowledge that the differences exist within every organization, every telco in every country, and therefore being able to adapt and build the services and manage the services in relation to the customer, the supply chain, becomes absolutely essential. The manageability of all those moving parts is what we need to aim for, and as a service provider community, we need to understand all of those moving parts, and especially how it rolls up to deliver the services down to the consumer and the business market. Now, all that remains is a few thank yous. Thank you to Juniper for the opportunity to dig into this underlying network fabric and its importance for underpinning the future of the telecoms industry. And thank you to you too for listening. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
You've been listening to Get Connected. You've heard from us, now we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you think via Twitter using the handle @Juniper Networks. And if you like what you've heard, remember to tell your colleagues and friends. Thanks for listening to Get Connected.